I was 36 the afternoon the courthouse smelled like burnt coffee and lemon cleaner, and I realized that grief can walk in high heels. I had worn my mother's pearl studs, the ones she saved for weddings and warnings. My name is Mara, and all the people who said I was too soft have never tried to breathe through a knife. I grew up in a church that taught me to swallow my rage and call it grace. Married a man who admired my mercy until he mistook it for weakness, and learned too late that secrets make their own weather in a house. My hands shook only once when the clerk asked me to sign my name on a clipboard, as if marriage could be inventoried like office supplies. I signed anyway, and the pen left a small comet of ink that felt like an omen I couldn't read. He smiled when he saw me, the kind of smile that had once made me laugh in grocery store aisles and now made my stomach stiffen like wet rope. My ex-husband in a few hours if his lawyer had her way, leaned toward the woman beside him with the easy intimacy of people who've practiced being seen. She wore a courtroom black dress and a scent like bruised fruit. And I thought, so this is the face my children will learn to be polite to. When the judge entered, everyone stood and the wood-paneled room rose like a choir with no song. I stood too, and in the hum of shuffling bodies I heard my father's voice from years ago, when I was a girl who believed apologies were glue. Don't let anyone talk you out of what you know. Back then I was just Mara with a library card and a spine of wishes. Today I was a woman with a file folder that felt heavier than its paper. I used to wake at 5 a.m. to pack lunches and step over Legos to listen for the clatter of my husband's keys to love a life that loved me back in fragments. I kept a notebook of small mercies, the way rain wrote itself across our windows, the way our son said hospital like hostable, the way my husband tucked his chin when he laughed. It's strange the artifacts that survived disaster. When the first rumor arrived, his late meetings, the whispered name he didn't mean to repeat, a receipt with a city neither of us had business in, I did what I was taught. I forgave ahead of schedule. People say betrayal feels like fire. To me it felt like glass, invisible until you bleed. It did not happen all at once. It was a dripping, the faucet no one fixed. The working weekend that ended with a tan he didn't earn in a boardroom. The cold that moved into our bed like a third person and never paid rent. We did what families do when they're drowning, we held still and called it floating. But silence does not save you. It just gives the lie more room to breed. And so I began to gather proof the way a woman gathers hair from a brush after chemo, carefully weeping, counting the strands you can't afford to lose. I learned passwords I had not asked to know. I learned which texts were kept and which were deleted too cleanly. I learned what the body can do when the heart is frightened but stubborn. There is a moment right before you decide who you are, when the sky inside you goes very quiet. That moment found me at our kitchen table at 2:17 a.m., lit by the aquarium glow of a laptop screen and a bank statement that didn't respect the math. He was good at lying, good at moving money like it was smoke, good at standing in our living room saying my name as if it were a lullaby while another woman's perfume argued with the curtains. He was not good enough. There were deposits that did not make sense, a lease in a city I had only visited on my mother's birthday, photographs that knew the shape of his hands. And then there was the other paper, the one I found by accident, a draft agreement in which I was erased with the professionalism of a surgeon and the eagerness of a thief. I did not scream. I made tea and thanked the kettle for not breaking. Grief can be very practical. It will tell you to make a list, and if you are smart, you will. I called the attorney I swore I'd never need. I took photographs the way detectives do in old films, except my fingerprints smelled like lemon dish soap and fear. I learned the difference between custody and caretaking, between alimony and apology. I learned the law is a language that will slice you if you do not hold it carefully by the handle. And then I learned something else: secrets warp time. Days became years. The night I told him, I knew he blinked like someone waking from a nap, and for a second I pitied him. Then he said my name with the kind of softness men use as a weapon, and I understood that pity is a door you should lock from the inside. So here we were, bodies aligned like chess pieces, each of us pretending to be composed, while our lawyers played the instruments of our undoing. His attorney called me emotional, as if that were a crime, and asked if I worked outside the home, as if love were not also labor. She smiled when she said primary caregiver, and I smiled back, because I've learned that a woman's calm can be louder than thunder. I watched the judge's hands. I watched my husband's jaw. I watched the clock swallow its minutes, and when the time came when the judge asked if either party had anything further, I stood with my file folder and every door inside me opened. The paper was thin and ordinary. That's the thing about evidence, it rarely looks like justice until you read it closely enough to bleed. I walked it forward as if I were carrying a candle into a dark room. My heels did not wobble, my voice did not quiver. I placed the page where it needed to be and said the one sentence I had practiced while the tea steeped and the house learned my new name. The judge read. Her mouth changed shape. Air shifted. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, or maybe it was my pulse. Somewhere behind me, a chair scraped the floor like a warning. And in that suspended breath, the kind that lives between thunder and rain, I understood that revenge is not fire or glass. Revenge is simply the truth arriving on time. The judge's eyes flicked from the paper to my face, and in that single glance I felt the balance of the room tilt. My husband's lawyer, so polished and predatory, leaned forward with a smile that belonged more to a dinner party than a courtroom. But when she caught the judge's expression, her lips pressed into a flat line, the color draining, as though someone had turned the dial on her confidence. My husband shifted in his seat. His posture, once smug, wilted. He tried to disguise it with a cough, but I knew him too well. The cough was the sound of a man realizing he had underestimated the quietest person in the room. The paper was an affidavit, notarized, bearing the neat signature of a man who had once shared office space with my husband. It detailed money funneled into accounts that were not supposed to exist, shell companies used to launder what he had stolen from the very corporation he swore loyalty to. I hadn't gone looking for corporate fraud. I had gone searching for evidence of infidelity, of betrayal of the kind that carves into marriages. Instead, I found a rot deeper than I could have imagined. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had betrayed everyone who trusted him with a paycheck with their livelihoods. And suddenly, this wasn't just divorce court, this was criminal. I will never forget the moment the bailiff entered after the judge whispered something I couldn't hear. The heavy double doors opened and two uniformed officers walked in, their footsteps sharp against the floor. For a heartbeat, the air was brittle, the kind of silence that comes before glass shatters. My husband's lawyer turned, panic threading her voice as she asked the judge for a recess. But the judge, calm and immovable, shook her head. She asked my husband to stand. He hesitated, eyes darting around as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. Then, when one officer placed a hand gently but firmly on his arm, he finally stood, his face pale, his mouth twitching as though trying to form words he couldn't find. I didn't smile. People think vindication comes with a grin, but mine came with tears I swallowed before they reached my lips. I remembered every night I stayed awake in that cold bed waiting for him to come home. I remembered the birthdays he forgot, the lies about urgent meetings, the perfume that clung to his shirts. I remembered the moment my son asked me if Daddy still loved us, and how I lied, saying yes because I couldn't bear for his small world to break before mine did. All of it cascaded through me as the officers read my husband his rights, their words steady and precise. He turned his head then, searching for my face. I met his gaze, and I let him see nothing but the calm of a woman who had finally set down the burden she carried too long. His mother gasped somewhere behind me. I hadn't even noticed she was there until then. The gasp was followed by a hiss, words about betrayal and ungratefulness. For a flicker of a second, I thought she might rush toward me, her grief twisted into rage, but she didn't. She stayed in her seat, wringing her hands the way she once wrung the dish towels I gave her every Christmas. I felt no anger toward her. She was just another woman who had believed his lies, who had built her life around his charm and ignored the shadows it cast. The courtroom buzzed like a hive kicked open. Papers shuffled, whispers ricocheted, someone dropped a pen. But in my body, there was only silence, a silence that felt like peace. The judge announced a recess and I walked back to my chair. My attorney placed a hand lightly on my arm, whispering that I had done the right thing. I nodded, though I wasn't sure right was the word. Necessary, maybe. Survival often is. Later, as I stepped out into the afternoon light, I found myself trembling, not from fear, but from release. The courthouse steps stretched before me like a path into another life. My children's faces flickered in my mind, their innocence undeserving of the chaos their father had sown. I thought of how I would explain this to them, how I would tell them the truth without letting it devour their sense of safety. I thought of my daughter, barely 11, and how I wanted her to know that silence is not the same as forgiveness. That you can love someone and still demand better. That you can be soft and still refuse to break. I breathed in, and for the first time in months, the air did not taste like fear. Revenge, they say, is sweet. But what I felt wasn't sweetness. It was clarity. It was the stillness of a lake after a storm, when the debris floats to the top and you can finally see what was hiding underneath. I hadn't wanted revenge. I had wanted truth. And the truth had set me free even as it put him in chains. That night, after the courthouse emptied and the news trucks disappeared, I sat alone in the living room with only the ticking of the wall clock for company. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't the same silence that used to suffocate me when he came home late. This one was different, clean, honest, a silence that told me nothing was being hidden anymore. I poured myself a glass of wine, though it tasted flat on my tongue, and stared at the stack of photographs, receipts, and letters spread out on the table. They had once been my weapons. Now they were just paper stripped of their power, their purpose fulfilled. I thought about burning them, about watching the ink curl into smoke, but something in me resisted. I needed to keep them not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of me. Of the strength it took to find the truth and the courage it took to expose it. When I finally closed my eyes, the past played like a reel of unfinished film. The first time I saw him across the university courtyard, grinning at me as if I were the only person alive. The night he proposed under a cheap string of lights he borrowed from his brother. The birth of our first child, when he kissed my forehead and promised me the world. And then, the unraveling, slow, deceitful, deliberate. I had believed in forever, but forever had turned into a weapon in his hands. Grief struck me in waves, unpredictable and merciless. I wept for the girl I had been, for the woman who had stayed too long, and for the children who would carry pieces of his shadow in their hearts. The following weeks were a blur of headlines, whispers, and judgmental stares in grocery aisles. The woman who exposed her husband, they called me as though I had been waiting for a stage. Neighbors I barely spoke to dropped off casseroles, their sympathy a strange mixture of pity and gossip. Some friends avoided me altogether, too uncomfortable to stand in the rawness of my reality. But others, women who had known their own betrayals, leaned close and whispered thank you as if I had spoken for them too. I realized then that my story wasn't just mine. It was part of a larger truth, a thread in a fabric woven with women who had been silenced, dismissed, and doubted. And suddenly my shame began to transform into something else, defiance. My children were my anchor. I watched them play in the backyard, their laughter unscarred for now, and I swore I would fight to protect that innocence for as long as I could. But children are perceptive. One night my son climbed into bed beside me and asked Mom, why did the police take Dad away? His eyes were wide, searching for an answer that wouldn't shatter him. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak with clarity. Because Daddy made choices that hurt people. And when someone hurts others, even if we love them, they have to face the consequences. He nodded, though I knew he didn't fully understand. Still, the truth settled between us like a fragile bridge. I promised myself I would never again let lies build the walls of our home. As for his family, the bitterness ran deep. His mother called me a destroyer, accusing me of turning my children against their father. She refused to see the papers, the evidence, the undeniable facts. To her, I would always be the villain in her son's tragedy. At first, her words pierced me, but over time I realized they were not mine to carry. Her grief was hers, not mine. Her blindness was her choice, not my burden. I stopped answering her calls. I learned that sometimes survival means letting go, not just of the man who hurt you, but of the people who choose to follow his shadow. Still, healing was not linear. There were mornings I woke up gasping from dreams where he still lived in our house, laughing in the kitchen, brushing against me as though nothing had broken. My hands would shake as I made coffee, haunted by the phantom of the life we almost had. But then, I would hear the sound of my daughter humming while brushing her teeth, or my son asking for extra syrup on his pancakes, and I would remember that life moves forward, stubborn and relentless, whether you are ready or not. And slowly the ache in my chest began to loosen. The irony is that I had never been vengeful by nature. I was the peacekeeper, the forgiver, the woman who believed love could outlast betrayal if you just prayed hard enough. But standing in that courtroom watching him led away, I realized revenge wasn't what I had chosen. What I chose was justice. What I chose was to no longer sacrifice myself at the altar of someone else's sins. That choice cost me everything I thought I knew about family, marriage, and love. But it also gave me back something priceless myself. And so the woman who once thought silence was survival began to speak first in whispers, then in conversations, and finally in a voice that could no longer be ignored. I told my story not for pity, not for applause, but because truth deserves oxygen. Because someone out there needed to know that the fire they were walking through would not burn forever. That even betrayal can carve a path to freedom. Months passed, but the echoes of that day in court never left me. Every time I drove past the courthouse, I felt the weight of those double doors opening, the officers stepping in, the look on his face when he realized the world he'd built on lies was collapsing. Sometimes I wondered if he replayed that moment too, in whatever cold place he now called home. Prison has a way of stripping away the illusions a man hides behind. But I also knew he would probably never admit to himself what he had done, not fully. Denial was his first language, and some people never learn another. The divorce finalized quickly after his arrest. What should have been months of bitter back and forth became a swift unraveling once the charges stacked against him. His lawyer stopped fighting me on custody, perhaps realizing no judge would hand over children to a man in handcuffs. And so for the first time in years, I was free not just from him, but from the constant doubt, the gaslighting, the endless cycle of suspicion and apology. Freedom, though, was a strange taste, bitter and sweet, sharp and soft. I had wanted it for so long, yet when it arrived, I barely knew how to hold it. In the quiet of my new life, I began to reckon with the parts of myself I had neglected. I took long walks alone, learning the contours of my own thoughts, without his voice drowning them out. I picked up painting again, something I had abandoned after our wedding, when he said my art was a nice hobby but not practical. My children laughed at the streaks of color I left on my jeans, calling me messy, and I laughed with them, realizing mess was just another word for life spilling over. But healing is never as linear as people hope. Nights were the hardest. There were times I woke drenched in sweat, convinced I heard his key in the lock. Other nights, loneliness crept in, whispering that I might never be loved again, not truly, not wholly. That fear was almost worse than the betrayal, because betrayal told me I wasn't enough for him, but loneliness asked if I would ever be enough for anyone. It took every ounce of strength to remind myself that I didn't need to be enough for someone else, I only needed to be enough for me. It was during one of those nights, curled on the couch with a blanket wrapped tight around me, that I opened an old journal I hadn't touched in years. The pages were filled with a younger version of myself, hopeful, idealistic, naive. She wrote about love as though it were a shield strong enough to stop bullets. She believed loyalty could cure deceit, that patience could turn neglect into care. I mourned her innocence. But as I turned the pages, I realized she had given me something too, a kind of stubborn hope that survived even after everything burned down. That hope had carried me through even when I didn't recognize it. I started writing again, but this time not about him. I wrote about resilience, about betrayal, about the strange alchemy of pain turning into power. The words poured out of me like water breaking through a dam. Sometimes my hands cramped from the speed of it, but I couldn't stop. And slowly my story began to take shape, not just as a record of what I'd endured, but as a testament to survival. When I finally read those pages aloud to myself, I wept. Not because I was broken, but because I wasn't. Then came the letters. He wrote from prison, pages filled with excuses and half-hearted apologies. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "Think of the kids," he pleaded. At first I read them with shaking hands, my stomach twisting into knots. But the more I read, the clearer it became. He wasn't apologizing because he was sorry. He was apologizing because he was caught. His words were weapons dressed in sorrow. And so I stopped opening them. I kept them in a box, a reminder that some doors must stay closed no matter how many times the past knocks. One afternoon, as autumn bled gold into the trees, I stood in my backyard watching my children chase each other through piles of leaves. Their laughter rang out, unburdened, untainted. And it struck me maybe this was what justice really looked like. Not the handcuffs, not the courtroom silence, not the headline in the paper. Justice was my children's laughter returning after years of shadows. Justice was me standing tall in my own skin again. Justice was knowing that I had broken the cycle before it broke us completely. I don't pretend the scars aren't there. Betrayal leaves a mark you carry forever. But scars are not weaknesses, they are proof. Proof that I survived what tried to silence me. Proof that the woman who once thought she couldn't breathe without him learned to breathe deeper without his lies. Proof that even in the wreckage of betrayal, there is still something worth building. And maybe, just maybe, that something was me. The final chapter of this story did not come with trumpets or fireworks. It came quietly, in the way healing always does, like dawn creeping in after a long night. One morning I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about him in weeks. His name no longer lingered on my tongue like ash. His face, once sharp in every shadow, had faded into something distant, blurred, almost irrelevant. That was when I understood I was no longer living in reaction to him. I was living for myself. Life began to feel lighter. I started making small rituals with my children. Sunday pancakes with too much syrup. Friday movie nights where we all piled onto the couch. Saturday walks to the park where we dared to dream out loud. These rituals stitched our broken family into something whole again, something real. My daughter began drawing again, filling her notebooks with bright colors. My son started playing soccer, his laughter echoing through the field. Watching them grow unburdened by the lies that once poisoned our home was the sweetest revenge I could ever imagine. They would carry scars, yes, but they would also carry strength. I sometimes wondered if karma had delivered enough to him. He had once been the man who thought he could bend truth to his will, and now he lived behind bars, where every hour was dictated, every movement watched. Maybe that was justice enough. Or maybe karma had done more subtle work. It had given him the time to sit in silence with himself, the one person he could never lie to, that I thought was punishment greater than any sentence a judge could hand down. But for me, the greatest twist wasn't what happened to him, it was what happened to me. Betrayal had cracked me open, but instead of breaking me, it revealed something fierce I didn't know I had. I learned that survival is not just about endurance, it's about transformation. I was no longer the woman who begged for scraps of affection. I was no longer the wife who stayed silent in the face of lies. I was no longer the girl who thought love meant sacrifice without end. I had become someone new, someone who could stand alone and still feel whole. There are nights when memories creep back in the scent of his cologne, the echo of his laugh, the phantom weight of a promise that was never real. But those memories no longer own me. They are just reminders of a story I lived through, a story that shaped me but does not define me. I carry them like I carry my scars, as proof of survival, not as chains. If you are listening to my story now, maybe you are carrying your own scars, your own betrayals, your own unspoken grief. I want you to know this: you are stronger than the lies that were told to you. You are braver than the silence you've endured. And you deserve a life that is not built on fear but on truth. It won't be easy, healing never is. But I promise you the moment will come when the weight you've carried for so long will finally lift and you will breathe again. And when you do, you will discover a freedom sweeter than revenge, stronger than justice, and more lasting than betrayal. So this is where my story ends. Not with him, not with the courtroom, not even with the scars. It ends with me standing here alive, unbroken, and finally free. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson buried in all of this. Sometimes the people who try hardest to destroy us are the ones who end up giving us back to ourselves. If my story touched you, if you felt even a spark of recognition in these words, I hope you'll stay with me. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear they are not alone, and subscribe so we can keep walking through these stories together. And if you have your own story of betrayal, revenge, or healing, leave it in the comments. Your voice matters, your truth matters, and sometimes sharing it is the first step toward freedom.